Time, in its unyielding advance, marks its journey across the human body. It carves deeper grooves around eyes that have witnessed both laughter and sorrow, weaves strands of silver through hair as a testament to worry or wisdom, and gently remolds the features of a face, inscribing each passing year with an undeniable, visible reality. Each of us walks as a living record of our own journey. Our physical selves bear witness to the storms we have endured, the moments we have accumulated. Yet picture, if you're able, a countenance that refuses this essential rule of existence. A face kept suspended, locked in an endless youth while the world outside rushes forcefully toward its decline. A silent, disturbing paradox that murmurs of something deeply, terribly amiss. An enigma so disturbing it would linger in the quiet corners of a modest Alabama community, causing its residents to question whether they were seeing a blessing or something much more ominous. Before we go further with the tale of Nora Vance, if you're just joining us, please subscribe and enable notifications and share in the comments which state or country you're listening from. Now, let's journey to Harwick, Alabama, and into a mystery that community was never truly equipped to confront. Harwick, Alabama, in the year of our Lord, 1871, was not a location known for grand declarations or thriving commerce. It was a community still regaining its breath, still tending to the profound, infected injuries of a conflict that had split the country, and especially the South, completely apart. The very atmosphere seemed to hold the subtle sharp smell of smoke and defeat blending with the rich cloying fragrance of magnolias and the constant dust stirred by wagons on unpaved lanes. The Civil War had concluded 6 years before, yet its influence stretched far and cold across Harwick, affecting every household, every field, every exhausted spirit. The men who had departed wearing their Confederate uniforms had come back, if they came back at all, with vacant stares and wordless pain, their bodies frequently damaged, their souls permanently marked. The women, who had sustained their households with decreasing supplies and growing fears, now confronted a tomorrow that seemed both foreign and hopelessly grim. The economy of Harwick, like numerous southern communities, was fundamentally connected to cotton. Plantations extended beneath the merciless Alabama sun, their white bowls promising prosperity that seldom reached the ordinary farmer. Tenant farming had become the fresh truth for many, an endless pattern of debt and reliance that substituted one type of bondage with another. Similarly restrictive, the liberated men, recently freed, moved through a hazardous environment of fresh liberty and deeply established bias, their dreams frequently crushed against the severe truths of Reconstruction period Alabama. Racial pressures bubbled beneath the surface of proper society, sometimes erupting in silent acts of cruelty or open intimidation, a constant disturbing presence behind everyday existence. The town itself consisted of a modest gathering of wooden houses, the majority in differing conditions of decay, their exterior paint flaking like skin burned by the sun. A lone dusty primary thoroughfare contained a supply store, its shelves poorly stocked, but its owner, elderly Mr. Abernathy, consistently willing to offer a rumor or a compassionate ear. There existed a metal worker, his tool creating a steady clang that broke the quiet afternoons, and a tiny, modest mail facility, where correspondence from far-off family members was eagerly anticipated, frequently delivering tidings of struggle rather than success. At the core of Harwick, both physically and emotionally, rested the First Baptist Church, its spire pointing toward the sky like a desperate appeal. On Sundays, its seating would pack with the community's residents, looking for comfort, direction, and a feeling of unity in the passionate addresses of Reverend Tate, whose voice could boom like a spring storm or calm like a soft wind, based on the apparent ethical shortcomings of his congregation. The pathways were largely dirt trails, turning to impossible mud during the heavy spring rains, and hardening into split, dusty routes in the crushing summer warmth. The noises of Harwick were basic. The far-off lowing of livestock, the chirping of crickets at nightfall, the periodic whinny of a horse, the mumble of discussions carried on entryway porches, and the constant hum of insects. The aromas were earthen, damp ground after a rainfall, wood smoke from cooking fires, the faint sticky sweetness of honeysuckle, and the sharp metallic tang of sweat from working beneath the sun. Life was challenging, inflexible, and profoundly conventional. Transformation came gradually, if at all, and anything unusual was examined, discussed, and frequently dreaded. It was into this existence that Elias Vance and his girl Nora made their home. Their dwelling, a 2-story farmhouse, sat a mile or so beyond the main grouping of Harwick, settled within a small cluster of aged oak trees. It had been an attractive home once, constructed with attention and satisfaction. Yet currently it displayed a layer of faded gray paint and a hushed atmosphere of neglect, as if grieving together with its owner. Elias Vance was a person shaped in the fire of battle. A previous Confederate officer who had come back from the battle sites of Virginia, an altered man. He was tall, lean, with a harsh jawline and eyes that appeared continuously shadowed, even in the most brilliant daylight. His hair, earlier a deep brown, was currently marked with early gray, drawn back neatly from a tall forehead. He moved with a stiff, almost military exactness, his shoulders always squared, his look direct but unwelcoming. In public, Elias spoke little. He would visit town for supplies, his carriage clattering along the dusty lane, and handle his transactions with a quiet effectiveness that discouraged pointless conversation. He settled his debts promptly, nodded briefly to those he encountered, and gave merely the briefest of pleasantries. He was regarded with a distant, careful appreciation for his military service and for his unwavering endurance when confronted with individual tragedy. Everybody understood he had lost his cherished spouse, Clara, during the war years, a loss that appeared to have emptied him, leaving merely a framework of the person he once had been. He was regarded as a person of integrity, if a gloomy one, and his seclusion was credited to his sorrow. At home, however, the quiet of the Vance farmhouse was a different type of creature. It was a silence born not of calm, but of a smothering authority. Elias's patterns were careful, nearly ritualistic. He would get up before sunrise, tend to his modest area of cotton and corn, and then come back to the home where he would prepare Nora's morning meal. Nora, his only offspring, was a fragile girl, small for her years with delicate characteristics and hair the shade of spun moonlight. Her eyes, however, were her most remarkable aspect, a profound, perceptive blue that appeared to contain an old wisdom, or possibly an old sadness. She moved through the house with an unnerving quietness, her steps barely audible on the worn floorboards. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle, almost a murmur, as if she feared disturbing the delicate calm that Elias so thoroughly sustained. Nora was, by all reports, a well-mannered child, excessively well-mannered, some might have murmured, had they dared to voice their thoughts loudly. She was always neatly dressed, her garments basic but clean, her hair always impeccably braided. She spent her days reading the few volumes Elias owned, or drawing in a worn notebook, her fragile hands moving with a quiet elegance. She seldom played outdoors, and when she did, it was always within the limits of the Vance property beneath the watchful, constant gaze of her father. The community's residents saw her as a quiet, almost otherworldly child, a delicate bloom in a severe world. They felt pity for her due to the loss of her mother and for the somber existence she led with her isolated father. They saw her as a child, possibly somewhat delicate, but otherwise ordinary. They did not yet perceive the disturbing truth that was gradually, subtly starting to show itself, a truth that would shatter the calm appearance of the Vance family and reveal a darkness that nobody in Harwick was prepared to grasp. The initial indication, a faint and nearly invisible disturbance in the smooth surface of Harwick life, started to extend in the spring of 1875. 4 years had passed since the conflict's conclusion. 4 years since Nora Vance had last been genuinely seen as a child of 10. Currently, by the calendar, she ought to have been 14, at the edge of adulthood, her physique starting to show the subtle shifts and curves that indicated the change from girl to young lady. But Nora, to the progressively sharp eye of Mabel Pruitt, stayed persistently, disturbingly unchanged. Mabel Pruitt was a lady constructed for watching. Her eyes, though regularly narrowed in doubt, overlooked little. She was a regular at the supply store, her basket always filled with the week's requirements, her ears always receptive to the currents of community gossip. She had known Nora Vance since the child was born, had observed her toddle, then walk, then develop into a quiet, pale girl. Yet something had halted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and damp, the sort of day that made the atmosphere dense and weighty when Mabel saw Nora in town. Elias Vance had brought her in, as he sometimes did, to collect a fresh spool of thread or a tiny packet of seeds. Nora stood beside her father, a silent, nearly see-through figure in a basic printed dress. Her hair, still the shade of moonlight, was braided down her back, and her face, outlined by the delicate strands that escaped her braid, was smooth, unwrinkled, and completely childlike. Mabel observed her, then glanced at her own girl, Sarah, who was a year younger than Nora. Sarah was all awkward limbs and developing curves, her voice starting to deepen, her face breaking out in the occasional blemish. She was developing, altering, blooming into adolescence. But Nora was unchanged. Her stature seemed the same from 2, even 3 years earlier. Her hands remained tiny, her wrists slender as a bird's bones. Her chest stayed flat, her hips narrow. It was as if time, in its endless knowledge, had basically neglected to affect her. Mabel experienced a tingle of discomfort, a chilly sensation that began in her belly and spread through her blood vessels. It wasn't just that Nora appeared young. It was that she appeared exactly identical. The same delicate characteristics, the same wide blue eyes, the same disturbing stillness. It was as if she had been kept like a specimen in a container untouched by the natural progression of years. That evening, as the crickets started their nightly performance, and the atmosphere offered a slight welcome break from the day's warmth, Mabel sat on her entryway swing, fanning herself with a palmetto fan. Her spouse, Thomas, a kind, but frequently oblivious man, was carving a piece of cedar close by. "Thomas," Mabel started, her voice hushed. "Did you notice Nora Vance today?" Thomas grunted, his blade carving a delicate curl from the timber. "Saw her with Elias at the store, quiet as ever." "She's not developing, Thomas," Mabel declared, her voice tight with a certainty that allowed no debate. "She's 14 years old, and she appears no older than 10, maybe 11. At most." Thomas halted, his carving, looking up at his wife with a wrinkled brow. "Now, Mabel, girls develop at their own speed. Some are late bloomers. You understand that. This isn't about late blooming, Thomas." Mabel insisted, her fanning stopping. "This is unnatural. I've observed enough children grow up in this community to understand what's natural and what isn't. Her face, her size, her everything. It's like she's trapped frozen." Thomas, a sensible man, shrugged. "Elias keeps her close. Possibly she just isn't receiving sufficient sunlight or proper nutrition. He's an odd one, that Elias, since Clara died." Mabel scoffed. "It's beyond that. It's a sensation, Thomas. A cold sensation." The next day, Mabel's unease solidified into certainty. At the fabric store, while examining rolls of cloth, she encountered Mrs. Henderson, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper observations. "Mabel, have you seen Nora Vance lately?" Mrs. Henderson whispered, leaning in conspiratorially, her eyes scanning the lightly occupied store. Mabel straightened, a flicker of grim contentment in her gaze. "I did just yesterday, and I've been reflecting on it. She hasn't altered a bit, has she?" Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice barely perceptible. "My Martha, she's merely a year older, and she's already got admirers showing interest. But Nora, she's still a child. A little doll. A doll that doesn't age," Mabel completed, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth. "It isn't right, Mrs. Henderson. It simply isn't right." The seed of doubt once placed started to sprout with alarming speed. The women of Harwick, with their sharp eyes and even sharper ears, began to observe. At worship, during the brief moments Nora was present, hushed whispers would move through the seats. "She's so tiny for her years. Looks exactly like she did 3 years ago. Poor child, always so pale." The whispers were not spiteful, not yet, but they held an undercurrent of fear of the mysterious. Reverend Tate, a man acutely sensitive to the spiritual pulse of his congregation, could sense the change. He observed the hidden looks toward the Vance pew, the uneasy murmurs. He comprehended that something was troubling his flock, something that resisted the natural sequence. And so, the subsequent Sunday, his sermon adopted a fresh, more threatening tone. His voice, usually thundering with righteous passion, started with a low, resonant hum that demanded focus. "My brethren, we inhabit a world of God's sacred sequence. The seasons turn, the crops develop, the children blossom into men and women, just as the Lord intended. But sometimes," he paused, his vision moving across the congregation, lingering for a moment possibly on the quiet, still form of Nora Vance, though he never identified her. Sometimes the natural sequence is disturbed. Sometimes things appear that resist explanation, that stand outside the Lord's design. He discussed the perils of vanity, of attempting to stop the passage of time, of interfering with God's plan. He discussed blessings and curses, of the mysterious methods the Almighty might select to display His displeasure or His divine intervention. He did not blame, not directly, but his words painted a vivid picture of an irregularity, a divergence that could only be understood as either a sign from above or a dark portent. The environment in the church grew heavy, thick with unexpressed fears. The community, already struggling with the aftermath of conflict and the severe realities of daily existence, now had a fresh disturbing mystery to handle. The whispers turned to hushed theories, some invoking sorcery, others divine punishment. The quiet, pale girl from the Vance farm was no longer just a quiet, pale girl. She was becoming a symbol, a question mark, a source of increasing dread in the core of Harwick. And the shadow, once faint, now stretched long and dark across the entire community. Dr. Ambrose Holt was a man of science, a source of logic in a community often guided by superstition and rumor. His office, situated in a small, well-kept building just off the primary street, was evidence of his systematic character. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and dried botanicals, a mixture of contemporary medicine and conventional treatments. His tools, though basic by current standards, were carefully organized. Gleaming scalpels, a polished listening device, glass containers filled with various solutions, and a magnifying instrument, a wonder of technology that permitted him to examine the invisible realm of cells and microorganisms. He maintained a small leather-bound notebook on his desk, its pages filled with exact observations, diagnoses, and the occasional frustrated query. Dr. Holt had trained in Philadelphia, a city far removed from the dusty lanes of Harwick, and had come back to his native Alabama with a profound conviction in the strength of observation, reasoning, and factual proof. He was a quiet man, contemplative and careful, his brow often creased in concentration. He treated all conditions, from the ordinary cold to the more severe fevers that moved through the community, with the same unwavering dedication to comprehending the fundamental cause. He was respected, if not always entirely understood, by the townspeople, who often favored the comforting words of Reverend Tate to the cold, hard facts of science. It was in the late summer of 1875, amidst the growing whispers about Nora Vance, that Elias Vance himself sought out Dr. Holt. Elias arrived at the doctor's office in his typical quiet manner, his face expressionless, his bearing stiff. He requested a complete assessment of his girl, stating with a chilling absence of feeling that the child seems to be developing slowly and there are rumors. It was a preventive move, a planned action to calm the rising tide of speculation, to present a medical explanation for what the community perceived as an irregularity. Dr. Holt consented. His professional interest aroused. He had heard the whispers, naturally, but had dismissed them as the typical small-town gossip, exaggerated and baseless. He anticipated discovering a slightly underdeveloped girl, possibly experiencing poor nutrition or a persistent sickness, nothing more. The assessment occurred a few days later in the quiet, sterile environment of Dr. Holt's office. Nora Vance sat on the examination table, her small feet hanging, her hands folded in her lap. She was, as always, disturbingly still, her blue eyes following Dr. Holt's movements with an intelligent, nearly knowing look. Elias stood in the corner of the room, a silent guard, his presence a heavy weight in the small area. Dr. Holt started his assessment systematically. He measured her stature, a mere 4 feet 8 inches, a height more appropriate for a girl of 10 or 11. He weighed her, a feather-light 75 pounds. He observed the fine, almost clear quality of her skin, the absence of any adolescent spots. He inspected her teeth, observing their small size, the absence of wisdom teeth, and the general appearance of a younger set. He felt her bones, sensing the delicate structure of her wrists, her ankles, her ribs. There was no sign of the strong growth spurts typical of a girl her years. He then proceeded to more private observations, his professional manner hiding a growing sense of unease. He observed the complete absence of secondary sexual features. Her chest was flat, her hips narrow, her body completely lacking the subtle curves that indicated the beginning of puberty. Her voice, when she answered his inquiries about her general health, "Do you feel weary, Nora? Do you have any discomfort?" was soft, high-pitched, and childlike. She reported no monthly cycles, no bodily changes whatsoever. Dr. Holt's brow furrowed more deeply with each observation. He inquired Elias about Nora's nutrition, her daily patterns, her general health background. Elias gave precise, almost rehearsed responses: a balanced diet, regular sleep, no significant illnesses since childhood. He discussed Nora's quiet nature, her passion for reading, her delicate constitution. As the assessment ended, Dr. Holt found himself in a condition of deep confusion. Medically, Nora Vance appeared as a girl of 10 or 11, possibly 12 at the very oldest. Yet, Elias had stated clearly that she was 14. The difference was stark, undeniable. It resisted every medical textbook, every physiological understanding of human development. He recorded his observations in his journal that evening, his usually neat handwriting showing a slight tremor. Patient, Nora Vance, age 14 years, per father Elias Vance. Apparent age, 10 to 11 years. Height, 48 inches. Weight, 75 pounds. Skin, fine, pale, no adolescent changes. Teeth, consistent with younger age. Secondary sexual characteristics, absent. General health appears delicate but no obvious signs of illness. No reported monthly cycles. Observations: developmental halt. Cause unknown. No obvious disease. Patient is quiet, compliant, intelligent. Gaze: unsettling. Father Elias Vance present throughout. Demeanor: controlled, precise, almost detached. An disturbing case requires further observation. A deep anomaly. The uneasy sensation he could not dismiss was not just professional frustration. It was a deeper, more fundamental sense that something was deeply wrong, something that went beyond mere medical puzzle. It was the sensation of examining a puzzle with absent pieces, but knowing with a chilling certainty that those pieces had not simply been misplaced, but intentionally removed. The logical thinker in him struggled to reconcile the facts with the inexplicable. The man in him felt a cold dread start to settle in his bones. A premonition of a darkness he was only just starting to perceive. To comprehend the chilling depths of Elias Vance's actions, one must first explore the shadows of his history, into the crucible of sorrow and loss that had distorted his very being. Before the conflict, Elias had been a different man. A proud landholder, a dedicated spouse, a man whose stern exterior softened considerably in the presence of his cherished wife, Clara. Clara Vance was, by all reports, a woman of ethereal beauty and gentle nature. Her hair was the shade of spun moonlight. Her eyes a deep perceptive blue, and her laughter, though uncommon, was said to be like the ringing of tiny bells. She was the light of Elias's existence, the foundation that kept him steady in a world that could often seem disorderly. Nora, their only offspring, was born in 1861, just as the first rumblings of conflict started to shake the foundations of the country. From the instant she was born, Nora was Clara's mirror image. As she developed, the similarity became remarkable. The same delicate characteristics, the same luminous hair, the same piercing blue eyes. It was a source of immense joy for Elias, a living proof of his affection for Clara. Then came the conflict. Elias, a man of duty and principle, answered the summons to arms, abandoning his young wife and infant girl behind. He marched with the Confederate forces, experiencing the brutal campaigns, the endless marches, the horrifying slaughter of battles that turned fields into burial grounds. He witnessed unspeakable acts, observed men he knew and admired fall, experienced the cold hold of fear and hopelessness. The conflict stripped him of his innocence, his optimism, and gradually, inexorably, started to erode his humanity. He came back from the conflict in 1865, not with a hero's welcome, but to a silence that was far more devastating than any battlefield noise. Clara had passed away in 1863 while Elias was still fighting in Virginia. Not by bullet or cannon, but by the insidious hold of tuberculosis, a sickness that ravaged countless households during those lean years. She had faded away, abandoning a grieving community and a bewildered 2-year-old Nora. Elias came back to an empty home, a ghost of the dwelling he had left. The light had left his existence, leaving him adrift in a sea of deep, inconsolable sorrow. In the living area of the Vance farmhouse, above the cold and used fireplace, hung a large, exquisitely painted portrait of Clara. It showed her as she was at the age of 14, a young woman on the edge of adulthood, her beauty radiant, her eyes full of youthful potential. It was a portrait Elias would gaze at for hours, his look fixed on the image of his lost love, a silent connection with a past that could never be recovered. And as Nora developed, the similarity to that portrait became almost unbearable for Elias. At 10, then 11, then 12, Nora was the living form of his lost Clara, a valuable, fragile reflection. It was a resemblance that for Elias became both a comfort and a torture, a constant reminder of what he had lost, and a desperate, growing wish to hold on to the only piece of her that remained. The first subtle clues that something intentional, something deeply unnatural was happening, started to surface in the scattered memories of those who had once been close to the Vance household. Elderly Mr. Abernathy, the supply store owner, a man whose memory was as long as his beard, recalled observing Elias Vance at unusual times, not in town, but down by the stream that wound through the woodlands bordering his property. Elias would be carrying a small woven container, his head bowed, his movements secretive. He seemed to be gathering something, not berries or mushrooms, but small unremarkable plants, their leaves a dull green, their stems thin and reed-like. Mr. Abernathy had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming Elias was gathering herbs for some home remedy, a common practice in those days. But the memory once stirred by the whispers about Nora now took on a more sinister shade. Then there was Clem Dudley, a large taciturn man who had worked as a farmhand on the Vance property for a few years after the conflict before moving on to find better earnings. Clem, a man not easily disturbed, remembered a strange, bitter odor that would sometimes come from the Vance kitchen. It wasn't the smell of cooking or of cleaning products. It was an earthy sharp scent, almost medicinal, but with an underlying bitterness that made his nose wrinkle. He'd seen Elias in the kitchen, bent over a grinding bowl and tool, crushing something into a fine mixture. Elias would always stop when Clem came in, his back stiffening, his movements becoming deliberately casual. Clem had dismissed it as Elias's peculiarities, another aspect of the man's grief-stricken isolation. But the memory of that smell, that secretive crushing now felt like a cold knot in his stomach. And then there was Nora herself. Her persistent exhaustion, her disturbing pallor, the way her delicate skin seemed almost see-through. She was always quiet, always compliant, never complaining. Even when Elias insisted she drink a particular herbal tea each morning or consume a spoonful of a thick dark mixture with her meals, Elias would watch her, his eyes intense, unblinking as she swallowed the concoction without protest. He would tell her it was for her health to keep her strong to ward off the illnesses that had taken her mother. And Nora, innocent and trusting, would follow. She was a child after all, and her father was her world, her only protector in a world that had taken everything else from her. The pieces were there, scattered like fallen leaves, waiting for someone with the intelligence and the bravery to gather them, to assemble the horrifying mosaic of Elias Vance's twisted devotion. If this story is already disturbing you, good, because what Dr. Holt was about to discover would challenge everything he believed about medicine, about fathers, and about affection. Press that like button to assist more people find this story, and let's continue. The summer of 1879 brought with it not only the oppressive heat of Alabama, but also a fresh disturbing tremor through the quiet rhythms of Harwick. Thomas Greer, a young man of 19, was a familiar and well-liked figure in town. He was the son of the local metal worker, a strong lad with a ready grin, a shock of unruly brown hair, and a natural charm that attracted people to him. Thomas was full of the boundless energy of youth, eager to make his impression in the world, and like many young men his age. His thoughts were starting to turn towards matters of the affections. His focus, to the surprise of many, had settled upon Nora Vance. It wasn't her liveliness that drew him, for Nora possessed little of that. Instead, it was her quiet mystery, her ethereal beauty, and the deep sadness that seemed to reside in her deep blue eyes. He saw her as a delicate blossom, requiring protection, and perhaps a little brightness. He had first truly observed her at the annual church picnic, a rare event, when Elias permitted Nora to venture beyond the limits of their property. Nora, then by the calendar 18 years old, still appeared no older than a child of 12. But Thomas, with the romantic idealism of youth, saw past the physical anomaly. He saw her gentle spirit, her quiet intelligence, and the haunting beauty that reminded him of a porcelain figure. Their meetings were brief, secretive, and charged with the unspoken tension of a forbidden attraction. Thomas would find reasons to linger at the supply store when he knew Elias and Nora might be there. He would give a polite nod to Elias, then a shy, hopeful smile to Nora. Nora, in response, would give a faint, almost invisible smile back, a fleeting warmth in her usually still features. Once he managed to drop a small, brightly colored ribbon near her feet, pretending it was an accident. Nora picked it up, her delicate fingers brushing his as she gave it back. And for a moment their gazes connected, a silent communication passing between them. Another time he observed her drawing by the stream, a rare moment of seclusion for her. He approached carefully, offering a few wild daisies he had gathered. Nora accepted them, her cheeks flushing a faint pink, and for a few valuable minutes they talked, their voices low, almost conspiratorial. Thomas spoke of his dreams of enlarging his father's workshop, of seeing the world beyond Harwick. Nora, in her soft, whispery voice, spoke of the books she read, of the stories she imagined. These innocent meetings, however, did not escape the notice of Elias Vance. His possessiveness of Nora had grown over the years, solidifying into an impenetrable shield. He saw every glance, every whispered word, every fleeting smile as a danger to the carefully built world he had constructed around his daughter. He saw Thomas Greer not as a hopeful admirer, but as a predator, a force that threatened to take away the last trace of Clara that he clung to so desperately. One sweltering afternoon, Elias witnessed Thomas speaking to Nora outside the supply store, a small bunch of wild flowers in Thomas's hand. The scene, innocent as it was, sparked a cold fury in Elias. His face, usually expressionless, twisted into a mask of barely restrained anger. He strode towards them, his movement stiff and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the young man recoil. Nora. Elias's voice was low, dangerously calm. We are leaving. He did not acknowledge Thomas, did not even spare him a look. He simply took Nora's arm, his hold firm, and guided her away, leaving Thomas standing alone, the wild flowers still clutched in his hand, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The public display, though brief, was sufficient to send a ripple of discomfort through the few townspeople who saw it. Elias Vance's possessiveness was well known, but this was something darker, more menacing. Then Thomas Greer vanished. It was a Sunday evening, a week after the incident at the supply store. Thomas had told his parents he was going for a walk, possibly to clear his thoughts, possibly to try and catch a glimpse of Nora. He was last seen by elderly Mr. Abernathy walking down the dusty lane that led towards the Vance property. The setting sun casting long shadows before him. He never came back. The alarm was raised the next morning. Thomas's parents, frantic with worry, alerted Deputy Orrin Falk. Deputy Falk was a man of quiet capability, his uniform often dusty, his face weathered by the sun. He was a good man, dedicated to his duty. But the disappearance of a young man without a trace was a rare and deeply disturbing event in Harwick. Deputy Falk launched an immediate investigation. He organized search parties, searching the woodlands and fields surrounding Harwick, calling out Thomas's name until their voices were hoarse. He questioned everyone who had seen Thomas that evening, carefully noting down every detail. He spoke to Mr. Abernathy, who confirmed seeing Thomas heading towards the Vance farm. Naturally, Deputy Falk went to the Vance property. He found Elias Vance on his porch calmly carving a piece of wood. Nora seated quietly beside him reading. Elias greeted the deputy with his usual reserved politeness. When questioned about Thomas, Elias's face remained expressionless. I saw no one, deputy. Nora and I were at home all evening. We keep to ourselves. Nora, when asked, simply nodded, her eyes downcast, her voice a barely audible whisper. I saw no one, sir. Deputy Falk searched the Vance property with Elias's reluctant consent. He found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no abandoned items, no recently turned soil. The farmhouse and its surrounding land were carefully kept, almost disturbingly so. The deputy left frustrated and deeply uneasy. Elias Vance was a strange man, but there was no proof, no evidence to connect him to Thomas's disappearance. The community's fear escalated dramatically. The whispers about Nora now mixed with terrified speculation about Thomas. Had he run off? Had he encountered an accident? Or had something far more sinister occurred? The quiet, isolated Elias Vance, once merely an object of pity and distant respect, now became a figure of dark suspicion. His unyielding control over Nora, his cold demeanor, his unwavering denial, all contributed to a growing sense of dread that settled over Harwick like a shroud. Dr. Holt, meanwhile, felt a cold knot of certainty tighten in his stomach. Thomas Greer's disappearance, combined with his own disturbing observations of Nora Vance, solidified his growing suspicion about Elias. The medical anomaly, once a confusing puzzle, now felt inextricably connected to a potential crime. The pieces were starting to align, forming a picture far more horrifying than he had ever imagined. He knew with a chilling certainty that he had to explore deeper to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or devastating it might be. The fate of Nora Vance and perhaps Thomas Greer depended on it. The disappearance of Thomas Greer, combined with his own deep medical confusion regarding Nora Vance, drove Dr. Holt into a systematic and relentless investigation. The logical thinker in him demanded answers, and the humanitarian in him felt a growing urgency to protect Nora from whatever dark secret Elias Vance harbored. His office, usually a place of healing, transformed into a quiet laboratory of inquiry. He spent his nights examining medical texts, botanical guides, and any scientific journals he could obtain, searching for any obscure condition, any rare plant, any forgotten folk remedy that might explain Nora's halted development. His search was painstaking, often frustrating. The medical knowledge of the late 19th century, while advancing rapidly, still had vast, unexplored territories. He considered everything. Rare genetic conditions, persistent illnesses, even the possibility of some exotic toxin, but nothing quite matched. Nora exhibited no other symptoms of severe sickness, only the deep and disturbing lack of physical development. Then a thought struck him. What if it wasn't a sickness, but a deliberate intervention? What if Elias Vance, in his twisted sorrow, was actively doing something to Nora? He remembered the old wives' tales, the folk remedies passed through generations, some of which involved plants with potent, if poorly understood, effects on the human body. He decided to cast his net wider, beyond the limits of conventional medicine. He drafted a careful letter, his handwriting precise and clear, to Dr. Leonard Price, a renowned botanist at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. In the letter, Dr. Holt described Nora's case in exhaustive detail. Her apparent age versus her actual age, the complete absence of secondary sexual features, her pallor, her quiet demeanor, and the lack of any other obvious disease symptoms. He then posed a series of questions asking if Dr. Price knew of any plants native to Alabama or the wider South that were known to have effects on human growth, development, or hormonal systems, particularly those that might suppress puberty or cause a stunting of physical development. He emphasized the unusual nature of the case, suggesting a possible deliberate administration. The weeks that followed were agonizing. Dr. Holt continued his daily visits, treating his patients, but his mind was constantly replaying Nora's image, Elias's cold demeanor, and the chilling mystery of Thomas Greer's disappearance. He felt a growing sense of isolation, burdened by a secret he could not yet fully express, a suspicion that felt both monstrous and terrifyingly possible. Finally, a letter arrived from Tuscaloosa, its envelope bearing the university's stamp. Dr. Holt tore it open with shaking hands. Dr. Price's reply was detailed, scholarly, and utterly devastating. Dr. Price acknowledged the unusual nature of the case, and after careful consideration, suggested a particular plant, Lithospermum ruderale, commonly known as stone seed or wayside gromwell. He explained that while its properties were not fully understood by Western medicine, it had a long and documented history of use among various native peoples of North America, particularly for its effects on fertility. He wrote of tribal women using infusions of the plant to suppress menstruation and prevent conception, and of its use in some cultures to delay puberty in young girls or even to induce a state of prolonged childhood. Dr. Price went on to explain that recent, albeit limited, scientific investigations into Lithospermum ruderale had begun to identify certain alkaloids within the plant that were believed to interfere with the pituitary gland and consequently the thyroid gland. He described how a suppressed thyroid could lead to a host of symptoms: stunted growth, delayed sexual development, lethargy, pallor, and a general slowing of metabolic processes. He noted that prolonged exposure, especially during critical developmental periods, could have deep and potentially irreversible effects on an individual's physical development. The plant, he added, was relatively common in the region, often found growing in dry open woodlands and along stream beds. Dr. Holt read the letter once, then a second time, his hands gripping the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. The words on the page were a cold, hard scientific explanation for the unnatural phenomenon he had witnessed. Every symptom Nora exhibited, her small stature, her lack of secondary sexual features, her pallor, her quiet, almost lethargic demeanor, suddenly made horrifying sense. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Elias Vance wasn't just a grieving father. He was a deliberate architect of his daughter's halted development. He was feeding her a compound systematically to keep her forever young, forever a child, forever the exact image of his lost Clara at 14. The realization was a blow to the gut, a wave of sickness washing over him. The intellectual satisfaction of solving a medical mystery was completely overshadowed by the deep horror of the truth. This was not a sickness. It was an act of prolonged calculated cruelty disguised as care. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, Dr. Holt knew he needed more than just scientific theory. He needed confirmation, a witness. His mind immediately went to Clem Dudley, the former farmhand who had mentioned the strange smell and Elias's secretive grinding. Dr. Holt sought out Clem Dudley that very evening. He found Clem at the local tavern drinking a glass of whiskey, his face marked with the weariness of a hard day's work. Dr. Holt pulled up a chair, ordered a sarsaparilla and spoke in a low, earnest tone, explaining his concerns about Nora and the strange circumstances surrounding the Vance household. He mentioned the plant, the bitter smell, the mixture. Clem, initially cautious and reluctant to speak negatively of a former employer, slowly started to open up under Dr. Holt's persistent but gentle questioning. He remembered the smell vividly, like bitter earth and something else, something sharp, doctor, that made your eyes water if you got too close. He described seeing Elias, often late at night, bent over a small wooden grinding bowl and tool in the kitchen, grinding dried plant material into a fine powder, then mixing it with a little water to form a thick, dark paste. He'd always be real quiet about it, Clem recounted, his voice dropping to a whisper. And he'd always stop if I came in. But I saw him, doctor, more than once. And I saw him put a spoonful of that paste into Nora's morning tea, or sometimes mix it into her porridge. He'd watch her drink it too, real close, like he was making sure she got every drop. Clem also recalled Elias going down to the stream bed, often with a small basket, returning with bundles of the very plants Dr. Price had described. Small, unassuming, with dull green leaves. He called it Nora's tonic, said it was to keep her strong like her mama. Clem finished, a shiver running through his large frame. But it always felt wrong somehow, a cold feeling. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were assembled, forming a complete horrifying picture. The scientific explanation, the eyewitness testimony, the chilling reality of Elias Vance's actions. Dr. Holt felt a deep sense of dread, but also a fierce determination. He had the truth. Now he had to act. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who enjoys dark history and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The worst is still ahead. The moment of the confrontation was unavoidable. A storm that had been gathering for years now prepared to break. Dr. Holt, armed with the scientific explanation from Dr. Price and the chilling testimony of Clem Dudley, knew he could no longer delay. The fate of Nora Vance and the lingering unspoken question of Thomas Greer demanded immediate action. He arrived at the Vance farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, the atmosphere heavy and still, the quiet of the property almost suffocating. He found Elias Vance in his study, a small austere room filled with books on history and military strategy, the portrait of Clara Vance, forever 14, looking down from the wall. Elias looked up from his ledger, his face expressionless. His eyes showing no surprise at Dr. Holt's unannounced visit. He simply gestured to a chair, a silent invitation to sit. Dr. Holt chose his words carefully, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Mr. Vance," he began, "I have come to speak with you about Nora, and about certain irregularities." Elias closed his ledger, placing it precisely on the desk. "Irregularities, Doctor. I assure you, Nora is in excellent health. You yourself examined her." His tone was calm, almost dismissive. A subtle challenge. "Indeed, I did," Dr. Holt replied, meeting Elias's gaze. "And my examination, combined with further research, has led me to a most disturbing conclusion. Mr. Vance, I know about the lithospermum rudral." The name hung in the atmosphere, a foreign scientific announcement that seemed to crack the carefully constructed appearance of Elias Vance. For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise possibly, or a cold recognition, crossed Elias's eyes, but it was fleeting. He simply leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped, his bearing still rigid. "And what precisely do you know about it, Doctor?" His voice was still calm, but there was in sharpness to it now, a dangerous quiet. Dr. Holt laid out his findings carefully, clinically. He spoke of Dr. Price's letter of the plant's properties, its alkaloids, its effects on the thyroid and pituitary glands, its documented use in suppressing development. He spoke of Nora's symptoms, how they perfectly aligned with prolonged exposure to the compound. He spoke of Clem Dudley's testimony, of the bitter taste of the morning tea. He left no detail unmentioned, no piece of evidence unpresented. When Dr. Holt finished, the quiet in the room was deep, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Elias Vance remained utterly still, his gaze fixed on the portrait of Clara. Then he slowly turned his head, his eyes cold and unblinking. Meeting Dr. Holt's. "You believe I have poisoned my daughter, Doctor?" Elias asked, his voice empty of emotion, almost conversational. "I believe you have deliberately stunted her growth, Mr. Vance." Dr. Holt corrected, his voice firm. "To keep her a child, to keep her, as she was," he gestured subtly towards the portrait. Elias smiled then, a thin, chilling smile that did not reach his eyes. "As she was, yes, as Clara was. You see, Doctor, you are a man of science. You understand the mechanics of the body, the functions of glands and compounds, but you do not understand the mechanics of the heart. You do not understand loss." He rose from his chair, walking slowly towards the portrait of Clara, his back to Dr. Holt. His voice, when he spoke again, was low, almost a monologue, filled with a chilling blend of sorrow, obsession, and terrifying logic. "Clara," he began, his hand reaching out to gently trace the painted cheek of his wife. "She was everything, the light, the warmth, the very air I breathed. And then the conflict took her, not with a bullet, but with a cough, a fever, a slow, agonizing fade. I was away, fighting for a cause that was already lost, while she was dying alone. I returned to an empty house, Doctor, an empty echoing tomb. Only Nora remained. A tiny, fragile echo of her mother." He turned, his eyes now blazing with an intensity that made Dr. Holt instinctively move back. "And as Nora grew, she became more and more like Clara. At 14, she was Clara, precisely as she was in that portrait, the same eyes, the same hair, the same delicate features. It was a miracle, Doctor, a second chance. A piece of Clara returned to me." His voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper filled with a deep twisted tenderness. "But time is a thief, Doctor. It would have stolen her from me again. It would have taken that precious image, that last trace of Clara, and transformed it into something else. A woman. A woman who would grow and change and eventually leave me just as Clara did. I could not bear it. I could not lose her again." He paused, his vision moving over Dr. Holt as if expecting understanding, even empathy. "So, I found a way, an old way, a forgotten way. The plants by the stream, the knowledge passed down. I researched. I experimented. I found the means to preserve her, to keep her safe from the ravages of time, from the inevitable changes that would have erased Clara's image from her face. I kept her pure, Doctor, untouched, forever 14, forever Clara." His logic was terrifying in its clarity, its complete absence of moral direction. He genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. He saw it not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of deep, desperate affection. He had preserved his daughter, not for her own sake, but for his own, to satisfy his own unending sorrow. "You see, Doctor," Elias continued, his voice hardening. "I did this for love. A father's love, a husband's love, to keep a piece of what was lost alive. And I will not allow anyone to take that from me. Not you, not the town, not anyone." His eyes narrowed, a hidden threat hanging unspoken in the atmosphere. "Some things are best left undisturbed, Doctor, for everyone's sake." Dr. Holt felt a cold dread seep into his bones. It wasn't just the confession, the horrifying admission of what Elias had done. It was the man's complete utter absence of regret. He was not a madman ranting. He was a man utterly convinced of the rightness of his actions. His sorrow having twisted his view of reality into something monstrous. He had committed an unspeakable act, and he saw it as a sacred duty. Dr. Holt rose slowly, his legs feeling heavy, his mind reeling. He had come seeking answers, and he had found them. But the truth was far more devastating than any medical anomaly. He had looked into the depths of a broken man's spirit, and the darkness he found there was absolute. He left the Vance farmhouse shaken to his core. The image of Clara's portrait and Elias's chilling speech burned into his memory. The confrontation was over, but the true horror had only just begun. The truth, once uncovered, has a way of unraveling everything. Dr. Holt, still reeling from his confrontation with Elias Vance, knew he could not carry this burden alone. The next morning, with a heavy heart and a grim determination, he sought out Deputy Orrin Falk. He laid out the entire horrifying story, the scientific explanation of Lithospermum rudral, the detailed account from Dr. Price, Clem Dudley's eyewitness testimony of Elias preparing and giving the paste, and finally Elias's chilling confession, his twisted reasoning for keeping Nora in a perpetual state of childhood. Deputy Falk listened in stunned silence, his usual stoic demeanor slowly crumbling into a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. "You mean he's been poisoning his own daughter, Doctor? To keep her looking like her dead mother?" The words were difficult to form. The concept too monstrous to fully grasp. "Not a poison in the conventional sense, Deputy," Dr. Holt clarified, "but a compound that has systematically stopped her development, her very womanhood, a deliberate act sustained over years." He then brought up the disappearance of Thomas Greer, connecting the dots between Thomas's interest in Nora and Elias's possessive rage. "I believe, Deputy, that Thomas Greer's disappearance is directly linked to this. Elias Vance would tolerate no threat to his creation." Falk, now fully convinced by the weight of the proof, moved quickly. He obtained a warrant, a rare and serious step in quiet Harwick, and returned to the Vance property with a small group of men. This time, Elias Vance offered no resistance, his face a mask of cold acceptance. He watched, expressionless, as Deputy Falk and his men searched the farmhouse. The search yielded damning proof. In the cellar, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, they found bundles of dried Lithospermum rudral carefully preserved. Beside them, a small worn grinding bowl and tool, still bearing traces of a dark earthy substance, and then in a locked drawer in Elias's study, they discovered a small leather-bound journal. It was not a diary of emotions, but a careful record in Elias's precise hand, detailing the amounts, the frequency of administration, and Nora's physical responses over the years. Entries like Nora's height unchanged this quarter. Good. Her skin remains smooth. The dosage is correct. Or chillingly, a young man, Thomas Greer, showed undue interest in Nora today. Must ensure her purity is maintained. The dosage will be increased slightly for a week. The journal was a cold clinical proof to his monstrous obsession. With the proof secured, Deputy Falk and Dr. Holt gently but firmly removed Nora from the Vance farmhouse. She was taken to Dr. Holt's office, away from her father's suffocating presence, for a proper unobserved examination. Nora sat on the examination table, her small hands clasped, her eyes wide and bright. She was pale as always, but there was a new fragile vulnerability about her. Dr. Holt spoke to her softly, kindly, explaining in simple terms what they had discovered. He told her about the plant, about its effects, about how it had kept her body from growing as it should. He watched her face, expecting confusion, possibly anger, or even a child's denial. But what he saw was a deep, heartbreaking understanding. Then Nora spoke. Her voice, usually a whisper, was still soft, but carried a terrible clarity. "I knew," she said, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "I knew I was different. The other girls, they grew. Their bodies changed. But mine stayed the same. Father said it was a special tonic to keep me healthy like Mama. He said Mama was beautiful and I was just like her and he wanted me to stay that way." She paused, a single tear tracing a path down her delicate cheek. "I felt tired sometimes and hungry, but not for food. Just tired. But I loved my father. He was all I had. He loved Mama so much. I thought he was keeping me safe. I didn't understand that it was wrong." Her confession was not an accusation, but a statement of deep, quiet grief. She had known in her innocent, childlike way that something was amiss. But her affection and dependence on her father had blinded her to the true nature of his actions. She had been a prisoner of his sorrow, a living monument to his lost love. Her own life and development sacrificed on the altar of his obsession. Her resignation, her terrible, quiet acceptance of her fate, was more devastating than any outburst of anger could have been. She was a child who had been denied her childhood, and a woman who had been denied her womanhood, all by the hand of the men who claimed to love her most. The question of Thomas Greer, though never explicitly answered by Elias, now hung heavy in the atmosphere, a silent, chilling implication. The journal entry, the increased dosage after Thomas's interest, the absence of any trace of the young men, and the discovery of the plant material near the stream bed where Thomas was last seen walking, all pointed in one terrible direction. No body was ever found. No definitive proof of Elias's direct involvement in Thomas's disappearance. But in the quiet, knowing glances exchanged between Dr. Holt and Deputy Falk, the truth was understood. Thomas Greer had become another casualty of Elias Vance's monstrous devotion. A thread eliminated to preserve his twisted vision of Nora. The unraveling was complete, leaving behind a landscape of shattered innocence and unspeakable horror. The aftermath of the Nora Vance case sent shockwaves through Harwick, a community already weary from conflict and hardship. The legal system of 1871 Alabama, however, was ill-equipped to deal with a crime so unique, so psychologically complex. Elias Vance was arrested, of course, and charged with various offenses related to the deliberate harm of his daughter. But the concept of stunting development through botanical means was alien to the law, and the absence of a body for Thomas Greer made a murder charge impossible to prove definitively. The trial was a spectacle, drawing curious onlookers from miles around. Elias Vance, true to form, remained expressionless throughout, his testimony a chilling repetition of his twisted logic. He had acted out of love to preserve the memory of his wife, to protect his daughter from the harsh realities of the world. Dr. Holt testified, presenting his scientific findings and the journal entries, painting a stark picture of calculated mistreatment. Clem Dudley recounted his observations, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. Nora, fragile and quiet, gave her testimony, her soft words echoing the deep sadness of her stolen youth. In the end, Elias Vance was convicted of aggravated assault and child endangerment, but not murder. The jury, a mix of townspeople and farmers, struggled with the details of the case. Some saw him as a monster, others as a broken man driven mad by sorrow. He was sentenced to a term in the state prison, a punishment that to many felt woefully inadequate for the years of psychological and physical imprisonment he had inflicted upon his own child. The community fractured, some pitying the grieving widower, others horrified by the depths of his corruption. The Vance name once associated with quiet respect became synonymous with a dark, disturbing tale. Nora, now free from her father's suffocating control, was a ghost of a girl. Her body, though no longer receiving the compound, had been permanently changed. She was taken in by a distant cousin's family in Tuscaloosa, a kind, elderly couple who offered her a quiet refuge. The transition was difficult. Nora was withdrawn, her voice rarely rising above a whisper, her eyes still holding that ancient sorrow. She had missed years of normal development, years of social interaction, Years of simply being a child. Dr. Holt, haunted by the case, kept a final entry in his journal, his handwriting now more thoughtful than clinical. The Vance case closes, but its shadows linger. Science provided the explanation, but could not mend the broken spirit. Nora Vance, a victim of a love so deep it became monstrous. Her body slowly may begin to catch up, but the years stolen, the experiences denied, can never be recovered. A chilling reminder that the human heart, in its darkest sorrow, can twist even the purest intentions into unspeakable acts. The limits of our understanding, both medical and moral, were exposed in Harwick. May God have mercy on her soul and on his. What became of Nora Vance in the years that followed? Her recovery was slow, partial. As the lithospermum rudral compound gradually left her system, her body began a delayed, hesitant attempt at development. She grew a few more inches, her features softened slightly, and a faint, almost invisible curve began to appear, but she never truly caught up to her actual age. She remained small, delicate, with the disturbing stillness that had become her characteristic. She lived a quiet life in Tuscaloosa, never marrying, never having children, forever marked by the years of her father's twisted devotion. She carried the scars of her past, not on her skin, but deep within her spirit, a quiet testament to the girl who never aged like the others. The unresolved question of Thomas Greer remained a dark stain on Harwick's history. His disappearance was never fully explained, his body never found. His parents grieved until their dying days, forever wondering what became of their son. The town of Harwick, in its own way, tried to forget. The story of Nora Vance became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones around crackling fires, its details distorted and embellished with each retelling. Some chose to remember Elias Vance as a tragic figure, others as a monster. But no one could deny that the quiet, unassuming town had witnessed a horror that resisted easy explanation, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can develop in the human heart. When sorrow and obsession intertwine, this story asks us something that has no easy answer. What does it mean when cruelty wears the face of affection? What do you think of Nora's story? Leave your comment below. If you want more stories like this, dark, true, and impossible to forget, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who enjoys history's darkest corners. We'll see you in the next.